Well, good evening. Holy indeed is our God. And I don't know that I have a big voice, but I really enjoyed singing that song tonight, Tony, so thank you for leading it for us. As I said, good evening. It's good to be with all of you this week in the middle of our week. I hope that it's going well for you. I hope that for all of those of you who are school teachers or you run on a school year schedule in your house, that you are excited right now. I know that it's getting to be that time of the year where that schedule is drawing to a close. I want to say thank you to the church on behalf of Fort Worth Christian, and I think I can say it for Holiday Heights as well, for the meals that were provided this week for the schools. I know personally that was received really, really well, and I think it's a great way for us to show our community that we're present and that we do care. So thank you all for your generosity and for all those of you who were able to help with preparing that. It was greatly received. At least I can say so across the street. I'm certain at Holiday Heights as well. This year, at the end of the school year, for my 7th graders, we start doing a project that can be rather humbling. If you're a teacher and you want to be humbled, ask your students to try and teach other people the things that you've been teaching them throughout the year. That was a mouthful, but run with me here. I have a project for my kids that they do called Who is Jesus? And they need to create some way of teaching other people about who Jesus is. And there's nothing more humbling than walking into one of the videos that they're working on and seeing the way that they're interpreting maybe who Jesus is and what he does. Or when you're playing one of the games they've created for little kids and you see a question, you go, what is that question? I didn't teach you that. I think Google taught you that. But that's really not accurate about Jesus. I've had many circumstances over the last few weeks where they were working on those things where I walked in, and the question that I ask myself, and maybe you've walked into situations like this before, is how did it get like this? Like, how did what you were working on turn into that? Sometimes it's just at school whenever you walk into a classroom and you walked out and all of your kids seem fine, and you walk back in and all of a sudden it feels like they've been replaced with rambunctious look-alike robots and they're trying to tear your walls down. Maybe you can relate with this. Maybe you've sat through meetings before. I know I have, where you're thinking, did anybody give some thought to how this whole meeting was going to be laid out or how it was going to be structured? Like it kind of feels like it's all just shooting off the cuff here. I've gone on trips before, and maybe you have too, where like I got in the car with my family and Kinsey for a week, and we decided that the full-size SUV was going to be big enough for 6 of us to drive like 1,000, 1,500 miles over 7 days with all of our luggage in our bags. And we thought, yeah, that's a great idea, only to get there and go, man, how did it turn into this? Like, where did that come from? I use my family as the example, notice, because Kinsey and her family are here tonight with us. No. Sometimes we get into these situations where we think, how did it turn out like this? And of course, those are a couple of really light examples, but there are a lot of heavier examples too in our world that aren't quite as humorous maybe. And yet I think the question, how did it get like this, rings just as deep in those situations. Like whenever maybe a relationship breaks down. And we ask ourselves, how did it get to be like this? It wasn't this way before. Or whenever tragedy strikes, we say, how did this happen? Or maybe whenever the world just seems to change overnight. Everything that we thought was going to happen in a day doesn't happen because of unforeseen, extraordinary circumstances. Maybe we ask ourselves, how did it get like this? It's a very different question in those circumstances. And I'll be the first to admit tonight that my reaction to those moments at times has been what I think the most common reaction to those kinds of circumstances are. My reaction has been that of apathy. Sometimes I look at what's going on in the world around me and I just accept the things that are happening because that's just the way that things are. Nothing can change that. I didn't cause all of these problems that I see going on all around me. It wasn't my fault that these things happen, at least not fully. Maybe sometimes I share in the blame. So what can I do about it? Like, it wasn't me that caused it, so how's it going to be my job to fix it now? I can't fix things on my own anyway, even if I did decide that it was my job and I should do it. So if I can't do it by myself, there's really not all that much I can do. And I think maybe you've felt that way too. as I say, I know that I have looked at things going on in the world before and said, there's just no way that anybody can do anything about that, least of all myself. Nothing can change that. Our sermon tonight is not going to come out of Psalms. That's where we've been together on Wednesday nights for the last while. But it's going to come out of Nehemiah. So if you want, you can go ahead and turn over to the book of Nehemiah now. We'll be looking at Nehemiah chapter 2, up through about chapter 6, but mostly in chapter 2. And one of my favorite scenes in the whole Bible is one that I think that we could very easily place in the category of kind of moments that we're talking about tonight, about how did it get like this moment. It's in Nehemiah chapter 2. And it's the scene where Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, and he's there to assess the state of the city. He has a goal in mind, but we're not talking about that yet. He arrives in the city, and one night late, he goes out on a horse by himself. And he finds that the city is just like the stories that he heard from his friends described to him. The walls around the city have been torn down. The gates have been burned with fire. There's not a whole lot left. Really, the city is just one huge pile, at least around the walls, of rubble. And Nehemiah is riding by himself on a horse very late at night in that city. I really kind of get, I guess, artistic with this in my mind. It seems like one of those scenes from like a Western movie where the cowboy's kind of out on his own. Maybe I romanticize it more than it should be. But under the moon, I think Nehemiah passes through those colossal ruins of the city. And he thinks about this city that was the home of his ancestors. He searches kind of like a light for some evidence of hope in those ruins. A piece of the wall that's salvageable, a gate that just needs to be hung back on its hinges and maybe not necessarily replaced. But he doesn't find any of that sort of thing, not that we're told about. It's a sad scene. And Nehemiah acknowledges that whenever he returns to the city officials. He says in chapter 2, verse 17 to those officials who they don't know where he's been, they don't know what he's been doing. He just rides up and he says, "You see the trouble that we're in, don't you? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire." And you have to think that for those people who have been there and know that they're looking at Nehemiah going, yeah, of course it is. Like, didn't you know this is what Jerusalem is now? Like, we've been living in this. You're right. What do we do? And it would be reasonable and fine, I think, if Nehemiah, who's come to the city all the way from Persia, the capital of Persia at the time, if he would say, okay, this place is really kind of a dump, and then he would decide to return back to his job in the capital, knowing that there is more work to do than what he can accomplish on his own. Like, he comes to the city and he has maybe an idea of what he wants to do, but when he sees it, I don't think anybody would blame him for looking at the desolation of those city walls and saying, it's too much, I'm going to go back to the capital. The king's going to be waiting on me. The problem really is too great for him. And this city is not his home. It was the home of his ancestors, but it is not his home. As far as we know, he probably hasn't even been to this city before. Yeah, this is where his people come from, but it's not where he comes from. He's probably never even seen it. It would be difficult, but it would be understandable, I think, for Nehemiah to go back right away and just say, what a sad place. How did it come to this? How did this happen here? But the next words out of Nehemiah's mouth are not, see you later, Jerusalem, I'm going to go back. He says, come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer live in disgrace. And he tells the people about how the king allowed him to come back to the city of Jerusalem and to assist with the rebuilding project, and how God had been favorable for Nehemiah in helping him talk to the king and in getting him to this place safely. And so the people decide as a group, there with Nehemiah, maybe not all of them, but those officials that Nehemiah has approached on his horse, they all decide right there, let's do this good work together, Nehemiah. And the rest is history. Literally, we have it recorded in history here. 52 days later, Nehemiah and the city officials and all the people of Jerusalem who had come together work, and they complete this wall. That really hard, difficult, challenging task, and it was, in fact, hard and difficult and challenging, they accomplished at a record pace. 52 days, and Jerusalem's future is brighter than it was the night that Nehemiah rode on horseback through that city. I want you to know that I found this story really, really encouraging. And that's why I wanted to share it with you tonight. Yes, it's easy to look at the problems in our world and just pass the blame on to the people who came before us or the ones who disagree with us about how to fix the problems that we are wanting to address. It's hard, I think, but it's understandable to accept that the troubles facing our world are too vast. They're too numerous for me or for anyone else to deal with on their own. Things have always been this way. In a lot of cases, the things in our world that we want to change the most are things that have been that way for a really, really long time. And they're that way for a reason. But Nehemiah was not there whenever the nation of Judah fell. He wasn't there whenever the Israelites sinned against their God. He was not the first person to walk into the city of Jerusalem and think, what a shame. This is terrible. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the first one. But he was the first one to look at the problem and say, we are going to do something about this. And then follow through with that. In Nehemiah Chapter 2, verse 12, Nehemiah says, as he's about to go out and wander around the city, he says that rebuilding this wall was something that God had put on his heart to do for the city of Jerusalem. Like this is something that he has determined when he arrives, like that this is something that he wants to do. God's put it on his heart. And I just love that. I love this part of Nehemiah's story. I find myself asking questions like, was Nehemiah even a builder? Like, did he even know what he was doing? Like, was that something that he was skilled at? Did he know how to do the work that he was determined in his mind was going to be done? And I don't really know. We know that he was a cupbearer to the king of Persia, but we don't know anything about his building skills. We don't know about his management skills. This wasn't his job. It wasn't his business. Besides the fact that this was his ancestral home, it wasn't his. He's literally going 1,000 miles in one direction to come back and rebuild the walls of a city that he's never seen before. I think that that's what makes this such a relatable story from our point of view, right? Nehemiah doesn't do this because God asked him to. It says that God put it on his heart, but really it's whenever people come from Jerusalem and tell him about the city that he begins to feel this way. And he doesn't do it because it's his job. It's not like God has told him, Nehemiah, this is what you're going to go do, or that the king of Persia says, Nehemiah, I'm going to make you the governor and you need to go and rule over the city and take care of it. He doesn't do it because of his family. As far as we know, everyone that he knows and cares about is in Persia, save one, Hanani, who comes back and tells him about the state of Jerusalem. He just does this because he hears about the situation that's going on in Jerusalem, and he is genuinely touched by it, by the sad things that he hears from the people who are trying to rebuild this city and resettle it. And it's not Nehemiah's fault. It's not his problem. It's just the reality that he lives in each day. Like that this is the way that things are back in Judah. This is the way things are back in Jerusalem. But listen to his prayer that we read earlier together tonight in Nehemiah chapter 1. He says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love. How powerful of words are those as he says them in the midst of what he sees happening in Jerusalem. The God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer that your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins that we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. He lays it all out there. Like, God, I want you to listen to my prayer. I want you to know that we know we've done wrong. And I think that attitude sits in contrast to what we often see in our world today, We have such a tendency to separate ourselves from things that don't directly involve us, right? And that's not what Nehemiah does here. Nehemiah is over here lumping himself in with all of the people of Israel, confessing his sins, even though what's happened, what's on his heart is not his fault. He says, I know that we've sinned, me and my family included. But he goes on to ask God to be with his servants. He says, God, they're your people. They're your children. And he prays for God to gather them back together in that place. Nehemiah is not concerned with how it got this way or with whose fault it was. He just wants to fix it. God puts it on his heart, and he determines that this is the work that he will take up to complete. I want to ask you, what if whenever our hearts were stirred by the problems in our world, we reacted in a way similar to how Nehemiah reacts? We live in a community, and let's just be honest about the community that we live in for a moment. The community that we live in has people who go to bed every night outside in unsafe conditions, not knowing if someone's going to mess with them or if their few possessions could be stolen. We have people like that in our community. We live in a community where children don't know if they will receive any meals outside of the ones that they get at the school every day. And in the summertime, they don't get to count on those either, necessarily. We have kids in our community like that. There are people around us who are struggling with addiction, but they cannot get the help they need, even though in most cases that help is there. They're just unable to get to it for many different reasons. We could sit here tonight and come up with problem after problem that our community faces. We could be here all night long. I'm convinced of that. And that doesn't even include the issues that are going on in our world right now, does it? Like the things that are happening on a global scale that we're concerned with, the problems and the troubles that we see on the news. It's easy for us to become callous to these things because we look around and we say, well, it's the way it's always been. What can I really do? Even Jesus says, you'll always have the poor with you. What can I do about those things? And sometimes we just grow calloused. I want you to think about who Nehemiah was tonight. Nehemiah is no one special. And I don't mean that offensively to Nehemiah, but I don't believe that he was necessarily anyone special. He's just a person who decides that he's going to do something. Sure, he did have a very important position. And his situation allowed for him to go and to help. And not everyone had that ability, and I understand that. But his situation is not substantially different from our own tonight. It's not his job that leads him to Jerusalem. It's his heart and the weight that God puts on it. Nehemiah's heart hurts because his heart is like God's. And he decides to act because this is what the God that he was taught about as a child always does in the stories that he read about. If you look back across the Old Testament, the scriptures that Nehemiah would have heard, what we consistently see is a God who acts for his people when they're hurt, when they're in trouble, when they need. He's a God who acts on behalf of his people. And I think most of the life-changing work that goes on in the world today is because of things that God has put on people's hearts to do. Some of our members right now of this congregation are halfway across the world working in a place that came to be because of the work that God put on the hearts of his servants. When God puts his work on people's hearts, I think that good things happen for our world, even beyond our own community. And in short, that's what I guess I'm asking us to do tonight. I'm asking you to change the world. As God's people, I'm asking you that whenever you feel your heartstrings pull you in a direction of people in need, that you would follow God's Spirit and do the work that needs to be done for them. And I know you can't do that alone. I can't do it alone. I think in the first few weeks of working in a church, I realized that there were more people who came asking for help from our community than even our whole church could support and take care of. And I'm sure you've experienced this as well. You've noticed this too. Nehemiah didn't do it alone. He had a lot of people in that city of Jerusalem who decided to join in that work with him. And I think that we would be shocked at the number of people who would join in the work with us if only we got it started. If only we asked. I'm not asking you to do all of the work or change the whole world. Nehemiah only did what God put on his heart to do. There were no doubt other cities that were in need of having their walls rebuilt. Undoubtedly, there were other cities that had been destroyed by the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians in those days, and those cities weren't the ones that Nehemiah went to. He only did what was on his heart, what God had placed on his heart. He saw an opportunity to do good, and he took it. And you may be thinking about all the things that I've said tonight, and you may think, well, that's a little bit too abstract, Colby. What do you even mean, like, do the work that God's put on your heart? That's how we're going to change the world. Like, that's a really exciting, like, motivational pep talk, but is it really, like, biblical? And also, like, is this worth our time as we come on a Wednesday night to listen about? What does it mean to do the work that God puts on your heart? How is it that we're supposed to go about this work? I think that Nehemiah gives us some examples of what that looks like, and I'm going to share 3 with you that maybe can bring a more concrete idea to what I'm talking about here. I hope that this will help you to understand what I mean whenever I say that it's our job as God's people to do the work that He places in our hearts to do. First, to do God's work is to communicate with Him through prayer and follow the ways that He makes favorable to you. If you were to look at the book of Nehemiah, you would see a book that is just absolutely filled with prayer. Nehemiah, within the first 6 chapters, has 4 different times that we're told that he prayed. We get some of those in detail, some of them not as much. And that's not including the little lines, because Nehemiah is written in first person, where Nehemiah just says a little short prayer as he's writing even. Like, there are even more of those if you were to read through the first several chapters. All that Nehemiah does, every act that he takes, is covered in prayer. And it is also led by the doors that God opens for him. He tells the people about how God has given him favorable circumstances to complete this work. Like, that's how he introduces it. When he says, let's do it, you can imagine the people are like, we're not really sure, Nehemiah. And he says, no, look at what God has already done to bring this about. When we want to join God in His work, we must communicate and follow where He leads. That's how we know that we're doing the work that God's put on our hearts. To do God's work is not to get discouraged by the obstacles that we face. Nehemiah, at one point in the rebuilding process, literally has people armed with weapons in one hand and tools to rebuild in another. Like, it is not easy work, and it is not obstacle-free. Regardless of how many doors God opened for him, he still faces trouble. Now listen, I'm not asking you to put your life in danger tonight. Like, I'm not standing up here doing that. But I am saying that if the work God wants to accomplish in the world was easy, then it would have already been accomplished by now. There have been many great, hardworking Christians who have come before us. And yet there's still work to do, because it's not easy. We cannot quit following God's Spirit and the work that He wants us to fulfill just because we run up against adversity. We must persevere. And finally, to do God's work, we cannot forget the people that the work is supposed to benefit. The people who are supposed to benefit from the work ought to be at the forefront of our minds. Nehemiah learns that the officials of Jerusalem are charging interest on the poor folk of the town. So much so that they are having to sell their own children into slavery so that they can pay off that debt. And Nehemiah is outraged at this. He goes to those officials and he says, this has to be fixed. And they're speechless. They don't know what to do. They say, okay, Nehemiah. He works to fix that, not because it has anything to do with rebuilding the walls. It has nothing to do with the work that God put on his heart to do. If you just look at what God's put on his heart to do is rebuilding the wall. The reason he works to fix it is because it affects the people that he's building a wall to protect. If there are no people in the city, what's the point of the wall? The work that Nehemiah is undertaking isn't just so that the city looks good again. It's for the safety of his people. So whenever he sees injustice, he isn't afraid to call it out. Nehemiah even goes on to become the governor of this region for 12 years, we're told. And he doesn't burden the people in the ways that the king expected him to. They were required to supply him with a huge amount of food. And Nehemiah says, I didn't take that from them because I didn't think that it was right. I did not put that burden on them. In fact, I had 150 people who came and ate at my table. but the people never felt that felt in need because of what I was doing. Nehemiah in chapter 3 has a list of people who work on the wall. And if you go and look at that, it's extensive. Like he's naming families and individuals of all these people and what section of the wall they worked on. It becomes clear that Nehemiah knew and he cared about the people of this city. These three things, if we can do those, remember to communicate with God and go through those doors that He opens. Remember to stick with the work that God has placed on our hearts, even as we face obstacles. And always keep at the front of our minds those people that we want to help, rather than just the work that we're doing. I think that if we can do those things, then the work that God puts on our hearts, because that phrase could be used to justify any number of things. I think that if we do those things that we've talked about tonight, those three things, that we will know that the work that God has put on our heart is truly His work. After all, we're called to become participants in the work of God through our decision to put on Jesus Christ in baptism. You see what Paul writes about in Romans and Corinthians when he refers to himself and his friends as co-workers in God's service. God works on us so that He can work through us. At least if we read Paul, that's what we would say. Maybe it's more fitting to use Peter's words tonight as we talk about building things. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 says, as you come to Him, this is Jesus, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to Him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Christ Jesus. Like we are the living stones being built up together to continue the work of Christ in the world today. We're offering spiritual sacrifices to God whenever we do the work that He has placed on our hearts to do through His Spirit. And we have a responsibility as followers of Jesus to look at the troubles facing our world and not think, how did it get like this? But rather, how can God use me to fix this? And who can join me in that work? I always try and offer a word of encouragement whenever I ask really hard things of the church, and I want to do that tonight. I honestly believe that the people in this room can change the world for good, because I've seen it. Many of you have changed the world, at least the world around you, into a place that reflects God's new creation. And you can call that optimism, but I think it's just called being faithful. And I believe that God has given us everything we need to address the problems in our world in a way that results in kingdom-building new creation. And I believe that the kids that I teach every day are even more aware and prepared to deal with those things. You need to know these kids are going to change the world too. They care a lot about the people around them. I'm hopeful for the future whenever I spend time with the kids that I get to spend time with every day. They see the world the way that God does. I would ask you that we not leave all of the work to them, though. Let's model for those who will pick up the work after us what it looks like to work with our God as He places His desires on our hearts. After all, the work of the church is primarily done outside of these walls, isn't it? Let's go and spread that with those young people so that they can see what it looks like to join with God in His work. Whether you need to respond tonight by asking God to work in your heart, maybe that's by putting Christ on in baptism. Maybe it's just asking God to fix those things that you know need to be worked on. Or maybe you need to respond tonight by going out from this place and partnering with God to work in the hearts of others, changing the world into the place that He has desired for it to be all along. Whatever the case, however you need to respond, you can do so now as we stand and as we sing.
There is